Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to Journey Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight, we are concluding our series on the prophets. I lost track of how long it's been going, at least a year, maybe a year and a half. And tonight, we are going to be finishing the second book of Kings. And with that, we're finishing the entire series. I'm going to take this opportunity to let everyone know that this is the last class till after Pesach. Everyone will get a notification when we start classes again. As far as I know, the next class will be on Sunday, April 19th. So between now and April 19th, there are no classes. And this is the final one. So this is for everyone who's listening now and everyone who will be watching this later. You will get notifications, email, and WhatsApp reminding you that there are no classes for basically the next month because of Pesach, and my wife and I are traveling. Hopefully, we don't know yet, we'll be able to get out. We're hoping to be able to be scholars in residence in outside of Baltimore at Pearlstone Retreat Center for Pesach, Bezrat Hashem. So the last 2 weeks, we have been delving into the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which is talking about the three of the kings that we learned about in the second book of Kings. And that was Achav, and Yeruvam, and Manasseh. So the last 2 weeks, we learned what the Gemara had to say about Yeruvam and Achav. And tonight, we're going to be learning what the Gemara says about Manasseh. For those who have been here the last 2 weeks, we already have established that, and we'll see it tonight just as strongly, that the commentary by the sages is seemingly very different than the text that we learned. Because in the text, these three kings were considered very, very evil. And many of the evil things they did are recounted. And in the second book of Kings, there seems to be no redeeming qualities to these three kings, and so much so that the Mishnah that we began said these three kings do not have a portion in the world to come. The Mishnah, as we learned, starts out that all of Israel has a portion in the world to come, and then it gives exceptions. And among the kings of Israel, these three kings, Yeruvam, Achav, and Manasseh, are said to not have a place in the world to come. So we learned about Achav and Yeruvam, and what we learned, which was very surprising, that the sages had a tradition that they weren't totally evil. And this is the importance that we have to emphasize all the time, that without the oral tradition, we can never understand the simple text, whether it's the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, whether it's the books of the prophets, the Nevi'im, or the Ketuvim, that you have a simple, literal text, but without the oral Torah, we don't have the full picture. And in this particular case, the fuller picture is somewhat surprising, because there's virtually no hint in the text to redeeming qualities of these particular kings. They are held out to be extremely evil, which they were. But here the sages had a tradition, and in some cases they were able to see in the text how we could see that there was another side of these three kings. But in a certain way, because they were all considered knowledgeable, it makes what they did even worse. It's one thing if they didn't know better and they go and worship idols and they cause all of Israel to worship idols and turn away from the Torah. That would be bad enough. But here, apparently, these three knew better. And nonetheless, they did great evil in the eyes of God. So that's just an introduction. So for those who want to follow now or follow in the future, we're on page 102b of the Tractate of Sanhedrin. We are towards the bottom of the page, meaning soon we'll be on page 103. We're at the bottom of 102b. So it says like this. The first thing the Gemara asks is, how do we understand his name, Menashe? What does Menashe mean in the context of his life? And so two opinions are given. The first one is Menashe Shenasheh, the name of God, Yud Hey. So here this verb Shenasheh means that he forgot about God. He knew better, but he, as it were, pretended and he forgot about God. The other opinion is that the same verb that his name is based on, but he made all of Israel forget God. It's not that just he did evil things, but he caused all of Israel to sin. So that's what's called a drasha, an allegorical understanding of his name, that he forgot God or he made Israel forget God. And then the Gemara says, and how do we know that he doesn't have a place in the world to come? As we've learned many times, and anything that the sages are going to claim, they have to have a source. So this is an interesting one, because with Yeruvam and Achav, there were verses that alluded very strongly that they would die in this world and they would have no place in the world to come. But about Menashe, so it says, V'ya'as hara b'einei Hashem, he did evil in God's eyes. V'ya'as asherah ka'asher asa Achav melech Yisrael, and he made what was called an asherah. This is a type of idol worship that Achav, the king of Israel, had made. And so the Gemara says just like Achav has no place in the world to come, here the verse says that he did like Achav did. So the Gemara is saying if Achav doesn't have a place in the world to come, from this we can learn that Menashe, who did like Achav, also doesn't have a place in the world to come. And then, if you remember, it says in the Mishnah that these are the three kings who have no place in the world to come, but Rebbe Yehuda disagreed about Menashe, not about Yeruvam and Achav. And Rebbe Yehuda says, Menashe yesh lo chelek la'olam haba. He does have a place in the world to come. Why? Why does he take an opposing opinion? Shnei amar v'yitpalel elav v'ye'ater lo. That, if you remember, Menashe was taken to Babylonian chains, and he was oppressed there, and he called out to God, and the verse says, and God granted his plea. God allowed himself to be what's the right word here? He allowed himself to be convinced to forgive Menashe for all the evil that he did. So Rabbi Yehuda said, we have a verse. It says that he did tshuva and God accepted it. So he's challenging the other sages. Why do you say he doesn't have a place in the world to come? So Rabbi Yochanan says both the sages and Yehuda learned from the same verse opposite opinions. The same verse, but they learn it in an opposite way. So what is the verse? I'll just do it in English, where God says, I will make the people of Yehuda a shuddering for all the kingdoms of the earth on account of Menashe, the son of Chizkiyahu. Because of Menashe, I will make the people of Israel like a bad example, an example not to be followed for all the nations of the world. And so Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion, why is that so? He says, because Menashe did tshuva, but the people didn't do tshuva so much. Remember, this is getting close to the destruction of the first temple. And the people did not do tshuva. Menashe did tshuva, but the people were so steeped in their ways, they did not do tshuva. And so because of Menashe doing tshuva, it's like he made all of Israel stand out as not doing tshuva. But the sages learn it exactly the opposite. Because of all of the evil that Menashe did, so all of Israel will look bad in the eyes of the nations. So now we've turned to page 103a. So we have this is a very interesting idea. From the same verse, they learn exact opposite ideas. But then Rabbi Yochanan says, and it's a very strong point, he says, Kol omer Menashe eino chelek le'olam haba, mirapeh yedehem shabali tshuva. So he says something very, very strong here. He says, anyone who's going to say that Menashe does not have a place in the world to come, he is going to weaken the hands of anyone who does tshuva. Why? Is because if Menashe is held out as an example, here is someone who did not do good in God's eyes, but he did tshuva, and nonetheless he is kept out of the world to come. So what kind of signal is that going to send to other people who do tshuva? Some in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they've spent a good part of their life not doing what the Torah and God would want us to do. And then they would learn, well, Menashe did tshuva, but it didn't help him in the world to come. So a person might say, so then what do I need this for? So that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. As he's saying to the sages, if it didn't say that Menashe did tshuva, it would be almost obvious that he doesn't have a place in the world to come because of all of the evil that he did. And the Gemara is going to go into detail about some of the evil that he did, which sounds even worse than the text. The text was not as explicit as the sages are going to make the evil that he did. So then there's a question that we had before at because Rabbi Yochanan continues and he tries to show it's not like he did tshuva in the last year of his life. And you could say, well, remember he ruled for 55 years. So you could say, well, for 54 years, he did evil. And then at the end, he did tshuva. I probably saw the writing on the wall. And he did tshuva. And the answer of the sages is, yes, it says that he did tshuva, but it wasn't sincere. They lost all faith in Menashe, because here he's in Babylonia, he's in chains, and now all of a sudden he calls out to God. And there's even an opinion that he actually called out to the names of all of the idols that he worshipped, and none of them answered him. He was still in chains. And then, as a last resort, seemingly, he turns to God and asks for help. And God does help, because he's returned to Israel and he's returned to his kingship. So the sages say it wasn't sincere. It was only because he was at the end of the line, end of the rope. But Rabbi Yochanan is trying to show it's not just that he did tshuva for a year or two or whatever. So I know we had this question before, but here it's explicit what the Gemara thinks. And that is, Menashe was 12 years old when he became king. And remember the same verse that we learned before, that he did evil like Achav had done evil. And so since Achav ruled for 22 years, so the Gemara learns that his first 22 years as king, he was evil like Achav was evil. So now he is 34. And that's when he's taken to Bavel in chains. And he ruled for 55 years. So that means from the time that he did tshuva, he ruled another 33 years, more than when he did evil. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan is trying to show here. It wasn't because he could have, as it were, faked doing tshuva, even though God obviously knows what a person is thinking. But even if it wasn't totally sincere, he could have gone back on his ways, but apparently he didn't. And so for the last 33 years of his life, of his rulership, he had done tshuva. And so this is a very, very strong question, because here we're not talking about halacha. It's not a question of what is the law. Does Menashe have a place in the world to come, or does he not? Usually when it's an individual versus the collective sages, we go by the sages. But here again, this is not a halakhic question. Call it a more philosophical question, whether Menashe merits or deserves a place in the world to come. So even if the majority opinion is that he doesn't have a place, this concept that Rabbi Yochanan is bringing and Rabbi Yehuda, that by saying that he doesn't have a place in the world to come, you're discouraging future people doing tshuva. Now, the Gemara goes into a very, very interesting thing, where Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, the hero of Lag BaOmer, and the initiator and the inspiration of the Zohar. So we're now going to learn 4 different opinions of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai about different kings that we've been learning about or not learning about so much. We've only learned it in the text, but not in the Gemara up to this point. So the first one is when Menashe prays to God to help him. So it says, Vayeter lo, excuse me, it says, in the text, it says, Vayechater lo. In other words, when God is answering him and accepting his plea, it says, Vayechater. And the Gemara says, shouldn't it have had said Vayater lo? That's what it should say. Now, why are they saying this? Is in Parsha Toldot, in the book of Bereshit. This is talking about Yitzchak has married Rivka, and it says that Rivka was barren. She did not have children. And so here, and they waited 10 years. And so the verse says, Vayetar Yitzchak Lashem. Yitzchak pleaded to Hashem, prayed to Hashem, L'nochach ishto, for the sake of his wife, or across from his wife, Ki akarahi, because she was barren. Vaye'ater lo Hashem, v'tahar Rivka ishto. And God allowed himself to be entreated. In other words, it's the same verb. Yitzchak entreated God, and God allowed himself to be entreated. The same letters, but the vowels are slightly different. And so here, where it says that God listened to the prayer of Menashe, so in the text it says V'yechater lo. And the Gemara says it should say Vayeter lo, just like in the case of Yitzchak. So they answer like this: Vayechater, it comes from the word to dig or make a tunnel. And so it says that Hashem, as it were, had to dig a tunnel in the firmament in order to receive Menashe's tshuva. Because of all of the evil that he had done, the court in heaven wasn't so eager to allow him to do tshuva. They didn't trust him. So here it uses the verb as if God had to make a new channel for Menashe to do tshuva. In other words, he had done so much evil. The question is, can someone who's done that much evil do tshuva? This is a very, very important question. But apparently here, this is what we're being taught. This is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is teaching, because it doesn't use the usual word that God allowed himself to be entreated, and uses a special word that we learn that this was like a special case, and that God had to, as it were, manipulate the rules of tshuva to allow Menashe to avoid the energy of strict justice. That's the first of four. So there I see S. It is what's called the way that it's written and the way that it's read. But I wasn't going to get into it because it's actually very, very complicated, because not every version of the Talmud has, or the way that the book of Malachim is written, not everyone has the version that it's what's called the way it's written and the way that it's read. And so it's actually very, very complicated. But nonetheless, that's what the Gemara says, that it says he tunneled away. and not that he allowed himself to be entreated, to teach us that, as it were, even for God, it was had to manipulate the heavens in order to let Menashe do tshuva. Now, the second interpretation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that Rabbi Yochanan is giving over, and that is when two of the kings, Yehoiakim, who is the son of Yoshiyahu, when he became king. Now, Yoshiyahu was considered a very righteous king. We learned about him in great length. And yet his son was evil, and it's Joachim. But about Joachim, it says, Bereshit Mamlechet, Mamlechet Yehoiakim ben Yoshiyahu. And also about a second king, it says, Bereshit Mamlechet Tzidkiah. So the Gemara asks, it's using the word Bereshit. That's the word that begins the whole Torah. That word has tremendous meaning. Why is it being used with these two kings? Because it appears that both of these kings are evil. So why is it using the word Bereshit in the beginning of the ruling of these two kings? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, from this we learn that when Yehoiakim started doing evil, that especially because he came from such a righteous father, such a righteous king, it says that God wanted to return the world to tohu vavohu. Because of the evil that he was doing, that God was like at the time of Noach and the flood, God was, as it were, about to throw his hands up and say, I have to end it here. I'm going to return the world to chaos and void. But it says that God looked at the generation of Joachim and he dropped his plans. So what do we learn from this? Is in this particular case, Joachim had done evil, but the generation was still used to his father, and they had all done tshuva. And so God looks at the generation and says, okay, for the sake of the generation, I'll pass over the evil of this individual. But in the other case, it's just the opposite. With Tzidkiyahu, so it says, again, God wanted to return the world to chaos and void because he looked at the generation of Tzidkiyahu. This is a generation that the temple was destroyed. And God saw I'm going to destroy the temple. I'm just going to return the whole world to chaos and void. But then he looked at Tzidkiyahu and saw that he was righteous. And so he said, okay, the temple will be destroyed, but I'm not going to destroy the whole world. And so the Gemara asks a question, because in the text of Malachim Bet, it says clearly that Tzidkiyahu did evil in God's eyes. So how does the Gemara come to say that God looked at Tzidkiyahu and saw that he was righteous? And so the Gemara answers that he himself was righteous, but he was a fairly weak king, and he had no influence over the people. And so he didn't, at a certain point, he didn't even try to get them to change their way. And that was considered evil in God's eyes, because right after that, that was like the last chance the temple was destroyed. And so, because he didn't protest against what his generation was doing, so the text says he did evil in God's eyes, but nonetheless, there was a tradition that he himself he conducted himself righteously, but he didn't, very, very much like Noach. Noach was the Torah says he was righteous, and yet he didn't plead for his generation. And that was in later commentaries, almost all agree that this was considered a great flaw in Noach, that he himself was very righteous, but he didn't really make an attempt to get the generation to change. That was the second of the deep teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Then a third one that Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He brings a verse that says, it's from Mishlei, and it says, a wise man contends with the fool. He rages and smiles, yet there is no fear. So rages and smile are like two different reactions of the wise person to the fool. One reaction is he rages against the fool, and the other one is he smiles upon the fool. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explains like this, that the king Achaz, so he was one of the kings of Yehuda, and he was considered an evil king. He was the father of Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu was a very righteous king. So I'm just reminding everyone, we've seen this over and over again, where righteous kings, many times, not every time, but many times, give birth, and the next king is evil. And we have the opposite. We have evil kings, and their son who takes over becomes righteous. So here Achaz is an evil king, the father of Chizkiyahu. And so God arranged that he would be defeated by the armies of Damascus. And so, because God was hoping that by being defeated, it would make him do tshuva. He would turn back to God. But what does it say about Achaz? It says that instead of coming to that conclusion, he began to worship the gods of Damascus, because he said to himself, well, they seem to have been successful. I wasn't. So I guess their gods are more successful than the God of Israel. So I'll worship them. So this is God like raging, because he gets Achaz to lose the battle, and still Achaz doesn't hear. Now, what about smile? So this is a different king, Amaziah, also an evil king of Yehuda. And here he is fighting against Edom, and God arranges it so that he's victorious. He's victorious over Edom. What does Amaziah do? He returns from defeating the Edomites, and he takes their gods and starts to prostrate himself to these gods. So here, this is God smiling on this king, and he also turns away. So whether God, as it were, rages or smiles on these two kings, in both cases, they adopt the idols of their rivals. That was the third interpretation. And now the fourth interpretation is a shorter one, and it's based on a verse that says that all the officers of the king of Babylonia, they came into Jerusalem and they sat down at the Teva Tavech gate. So the question is, what is this gate? And it's based on a word that means decisions. And so it's learned that it's by this gate that the Sanhedrin sat up on the Temple Mount. And so what does it mean that all these officers came and they sat down at the Tavech gate? So Reb Papa says, this is what we learned from this is this in this spot, the Sanhedrin once sat. And now those that are going to destroy the temple and did destroy the temple, now they're sitting in the same place. And so they said this is a common saying, on the spot where the master formerly hung his weapon, there the simple shepherd hangs his jug. So here the officers of Babylonia are sitting in the same place where the great sages of the Sanhedrin once sat. So then Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says like this. He quotes from Job, from Eov, and says, "V'yimaneh mirashaim oram uzroa rama tishaber." So it says, from the wicked, the light for the wicked will be held back, and their high arm will be broken. In other words, their arrogance, their pride will be broken. Now, in the word for the wicked is Rishayim. And here we have a very, very unique linguistic phenomena with a letter, that in the word Rishayim, the ayin is placed above the rest of the letters. Not totally above, but instead of being in the same line, it's raised up. And so the Gemara says, what is the meaning of this? Why is the ayin raised up? If you read the word Rishayim without the ayin, then it's Rashim, which means poor people. A Rash means a poor person. And so Shimon ben Lakish learns like this. He says that Kevan shenaseh adam rash milamata, naseh rash milamala. When a person becomes poor of friends below in this world, he becomes poor from friends in the upper worlds. In other words, what happens down here affects this person's fate or destiny in the upper worlds. And then the opposite. That once a person, that's what he says. So then the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if the raised ayin it's being read as if it's not there at all, so why don't you just leave the ayin out of the word? But really, the answer would be, without the ayin, then it doesn't mean wicked. And the original verse is, and from the wicked, their light will be withheld, and their high arm will be broken. So if you take the ayin away, now it says, from the poor people. But nonetheless, that's what's being learned here. That because this person is an evil person, they do not have friends in this world. And therefore, they're not going to have friends, as it were, above. And so the Gemara says, so let them just take away the ayin. And so the answer, no, they're going to keep the ayin because we have two examples of people who were hated in this world, but it doesn't mean they were hated in the upper worlds. And who are the two people? One was David HaMelech. David HaMelech had many, many enemies, non-Jewish and Jewish. He just had a lot of enemies, but he was beloved above. And the other one is Nehemiah. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah is one of the great individuals who led people back from at that time it was Persia, after the whole story of Purim, when Cyrus allowed the temple to be rebuilt and the Jews to go back. Unfortunately, only a very, very few actually went back. But they were led by Ezra and Nehemiah. And also, because Nehemiah, he was more in charge of just setting up everything in the land of Israel for the return of the exiles, he made a lot of enemies. And so here they say, we can't take the ayin away because we have examples of people who were poor of friends in this world, but they were still beloved above. So here I'll just bring you the saying from the Baal Shem Tov, where in the Shir HaMa'alot, one of the Psalms, where it says, Hashem tzilcha al yad yeminecha. God is your shadow on your right side. So the simple understanding, the little understanding is God, a shadow is protecting you on your right side. Right is always indicative of chesed. So the simple meaning is God is protecting you on your right side. The Baal Shem Tov read it almost more literally. He said, what is itself? What is a shadow? A shadow acts like the person creating the shadow. If a person raises their hand and looking, the shadow will raise its hand. If a person starts jumping up and down, the shadow starts jumping up and down. And so the Baal Shem Tov explained that God is your shadow. The way you act in this world, God will mirror that. God will shadow that back to you. And there are many sayings for the same thing as you reap what you sow. You are what you eat. Many, many different phrases for this idea that according to our actions, that is the response that we can expect. So that's very connected to what we just learned. This idea is that if a person, and it says it in Pirkei Avot, it says it clearly that if a person doesn't find favor with people in this world, then they're not going to find favor with God in the upper worlds. So that's, of course, a very, very important idea. Now, remember, we learned in previous classes that Yeruvam, Achav, and Menashe were all considered Talmidei Chachamim. They were scholars. They were very well versed. And we learned a number of things about that. So here it says, it continues the same idea. It says, Menashe haya shoneh 55 panim b'Torat Kohanim. That there's a tradition that Menashe would give explanations, 55 different explanations for the book of Leviticus. And some say that why 55? Because he ruled for 55 years. Every year of his rule, he had a different novel explanation of the book of Leviticus. And it continues. It says about Achav that he had 85. He was able to say 85 facets of the book of Leviticus, and Yeruvam 103 facets. So the Gemara doesn't explain how those numbers work. The 55, the Gemara says it's because he ruled for 55 years. Yet the commentaries, like the same surprise that we have, saying, how can it be that in this case, Menashe, during all those 22 years where he did evil, he took the time to say Chidushei Torah on the book of Vayikra, novel ideas about the book of Vayikra. So some of the commentaries say what it means is before he started doing evil, he had the ability to see 55 different perceptions, facets of the book of Vayikra. But it's like, how can we even understand that while they're doing evil and bowing to idols, that they are learning Torah at the same time? So here again, we have what the text says, and then we have these traditions that they weren't completely evil. And one of the things we discussed before is just this basic idea that we learned a number of different incidences that, except for maybe a few exceptions, every evil person is going to have a little bit of good. And every good person, there's even a verse that says there's no tzaddik on the earth that does good and doesn't sin. So the simple understanding is, what does it mean? How can you call him a tzaddik if he sins? So the Baal Shem Tov explains it doesn't mean a sin in the way we usually use that word. What it means is that even in a tzaddik, there may be the slightest little bit of pride or lack of humbleness or some type of feeling that they're going to get something out of it, whether it's like the world to come or some kind of recognition. And it might be totally unconscious. But the Baal Shem Tov is saying that, I mean, that's the verse. The verse says there's no tzaddik in the earth that does only good and doesn't sin. So here, this Gemara is like a prime example of taking people that really did do evil. There's no doubt about it. But here, mixed in, there is some goodness along the way. Okay, then we're still in 103b in the middle. We're not doing every single thing that it says. We do not have time for that. But here it says, it goes back to a verse that we learned, and that is, V'gam dam naki shafach Menashe harbe ma'od ad asher milei et Yerushalayim peh lepeh. So it says in the book of Kings, it says that Menashe shed innocent blood very much until all of Jerusalem was filled from end to end. And the Gemara explains that, what does it mean? Do we understand that literally the streets ran with blood from what Menashe was doing? And so here it brings the tradition that what they're talking about is that Menashe killed Isaiah. Isaiah was his grandfather. The great prophet Isaiah was the grandfather. His daughter, Mary, was the mother of Menashe. And he had him, along with many of the other prophets, killed. And so they say, like, this opinion, he killed one person. Here it seems like he kills one person, and it's written as if he filled the entire streets of Jerusalem with blood. So they say, like, whose opinion is that we can understand that by killing one person, it's as if filling the streets with blood? And they say it's the opinion of Rabba Bar Chana, who says, Sadiq echad keneged kol ha'olam kulo, because he said one Sadiq can be weighed against the entire world. So you kill one Sadiq as if you've shed blood that is filling the streets of Jerusalem. So it goes along with the idea that's said in the Gemara that one who kills another person, it's as if they destroyed an entire world. It's a very well-known statement. By killing one person, it's as if you killed an entire world. And then there are two different verses when it's talking about Menashe. One says that he made a graven image in the singular. And then there's another verse that he made graven images in the plural. So we have a contradiction. Did he just worship one idol, or did he establish many, many different idols? So Rabbi Yochanan said at first, and this is talking about he set up an idol in the temple. And at first, he made it with just one like face. But afterwards, he made it with four faces, so that whatever direction that God would be looking from, he would be enraged by this idol that Menashe set up. In other words, he went to such a distance to show, for whatever reason, his anger at God, that he wanted to anger God. And so at first he just set up an image in the temple, but then he put four faces in each of the directions, so that it would be, if God was looking in any of the directions, he would be enraged. That's how little Menashe cared what God thought of him. And then it says that Achaz, again, the father of Chizkiyahu, so he put an idol in the upper chamber of the temple. And then Menashe placed the graven image in the sanctuary. That's where the menorah was, and the showbread, and the altar of the incense. And then his son, Ammon, he put one in the Holy of Holies. So again, it just stretches our imagination how far some of these kings went to distance themselves from God. It's almost here. Okay, let's say you have an atheist, or you have someone who loses faith in God and refuses to go to synagogue or church or mosque or whatever. But here you have all these cases are being brought of kings that went out of their way to show their disdain and disbelief in God. It's very, very hard to understand. Okay, then I'll be honest. I'm not even going to go into this next section where one of the kings even had relations with his mother, again to show, and his mother kind of said, like, how, she was forced. How can you do this? And he answered, he said, my only purpose is to vex my creator. So again, here we see the depths of evil that it's very hard to comprehend. Very, very hard to comprehend what we're being told here. And with this, we've finished with Manasseh. Then the Gemara goes on about other kings and the evil that they did, other people who aren't kings who did evil, those who do not have a place in the world to come, those who we might think should not have a place in the world to come, but they're included for whatever reason. These teachings of the last 3 weeks, they really take a lot of thought and meditation and understanding the depths of evil that these kings reached. And if you remember, one of the ideas that one of the sages had a dream, and Manasseh came to him in a dream. We learned a whole story about it. But he asked him in the dream, this is really connected to many of these stories. And that is, Manasseh said to this sage, he said, if you would have lived at the same time as I did, you would have run to serve these gods. And that is just, it takes a whole paradigm shift. And we discussed this at length to understand the power in those days of idol worship. One of the stories that we didn't have a time to go over, but it fits in very well here, is we're told by the time of the second temple that the sages got together and they prayed that this desire to worship idols would be taken away from the world. And according to the Gemara, they were somewhat successful. I wouldn't say completely successful, because even today, there are many, many different types of idol worship. It doesn't necessarily mean worshiping a idol of wood and stone and a false god. Just that people put their trust and their faith in things other than God and build them up to such a point that it becomes like idol worship. And then there is trappings of idol worship that still exist in the world. But we discussed this, and I'm just mentioning it here, is along with the concept of bowing down to an idol, was a whole avoda, a whole service, a whole philosophy that went along with each of these gods. And they appealed to people's lower natures. Just like we all have an animal soul. In those days, the animal soul was drawn to these different worships. And in Hebrew, they're called idol worship. One of the terms is avodah zarah, which means a strange service. In other words, it's appealing to the animal soul. And we know from all kinds of addictions in this world, and not just to drugs or alcohol or gambling or sex. There's all kinds of types of behavior like this, addictions. Probably the biggest addiction worldwide now is our devices. That people are seriously addicted to their devices. So here, just to wrap up what we've been learning, the sages are again, we just like we read and studied the simple text, here we've tried to learn the words of the sages. We try to introduce some ideas behind what they're trying to say. But anything in the oral tradition takes a lot of study, a lot of review, a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, a lot of perspective to get to the bottom of all these different ideas. And so here, it just happened that we ended with kind of like on a sour note, talking about how evil these kings had become. But if you look at the world in general, there's still a lot of evil, and it comes in many, many different guises. And I think really, especially the last thing we learned of the king who slept with his mother and said, I'm only doing this to anger God. But this is telling us that there are a lot of people in the world who are angry at God. Doesn't mean that they go to these lengths to show their anger. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people who their anger comes from, I would say, a disappointment, that they wanted so much more out of life. They wanted so much more of God. They wanted so much more blessing and protection and success. And many times people turn a lack of blessing and success to being very, very angry at God. And so here, these stories seem very, very extreme, but they're very, very real about human emotions. And that, I'm just inviting everyone. You could review this. You can get this online in Hebrew, in English, Sefaria. We did basically from pages 101 through 103. And here we are ending our series. So I want to take this opportunity for all those who are live with us now and all the many, many people who will be watching this week. If you have followed this series, we hope that everyone has learned, and we really appreciate everyone who stuck with us through all of this learning. And after Pesach, I will come up with something new, a new series, and we will reconnect then. In the meantime, I want to bless everyone with a Pesach Kasher v'Sameach. May we see miracles and wonders. Everyone knows it's a very, very difficult time in Israel for the Jewish people everywhere. I'd say everyone, the whole planet this is just not an easy time, and we need redemption. We need God's help, and so I invite everyone to open their hearts and to really, really ask God for help to get us through these hard times, and that Be'ezrat Hashem, that this month should bring us a complete and total redemption.